the debate. Our subject today is, well, the fundamental nature of reality itself. We're addressing a profound tension we see in the source material, this clash between our individual, seemingly subjective observations, the different photons perceived by every observer, and the bedrock of apparently immutable, universal principles of physics, particularly causality. This forces us to confront a central question. Does the coherence of our shared reality fundamentally rely on fixed, eternal physical laws, or is reality perhaps an emergent, constantly interpreted, and frankly often subjective construct that's maintained primarily through psychological and social consensus?
I see why you frame it as a reliance on fixed law, but I'd argue that tension you describe is precisely where reality's greatest fragility lies. My position is that coherence is really a temporary, emergent phenomenon. It's best understood not as some fixed structure, but maybe as a game, a serious one, mind you, that is constantly, failing due to deep-seated psychological and sociological obstacles.
Well, my position is that the reality we share is ultimately guaranteed, maybe even enforced, by an eternal, non-transactional law. Now, when I use that term non-transactional law, I mean a system of universal requirements that operates completely outside of human negotiation, social contract, or consensus. While human interpretation is certainly necessary to navigate the world, I see it as merely the flawed process by which we attempt to converge upon these already existing objective principles.
And I come at it from a completely different direction. I'm asserting that fundamental coherence is temporary, it's fluid, and often it's illusory. We confuse the necessary scaffolding of physics, the rules, if you will, with the actual lived experience of reality, which is fundamentally interpretive. I mean, if our mechanisms for processing external facts are broken, then that objective law quickly becomes, almost irrelevant in practice.
Okay, but I must begin with what I see as the cosmic mandate. The universe, it demands a single consistent reality model. This model is enforced by laws that are unchanging and operate entirely independent of human awareness or desire. This coherence is secured primarily by what the material calls the fixed point of causality.
The fixed point, right.
Exactly. The integrity of the cosmos requires that the universe must treat time as a fixed coordinate to prevent causality violations. And we aren't just talking about theoretical time travel paradoxes here. We're talking about potential existential collapse. If I could genuinely travel backward to prevent an event that formed me, the universe would theoretically be forced into infinite regression, or maybe perpetual splitting or replicating itself just to maintain consistency across every possible branch. The universe avoids this catastrophe by making us, structurally, a prisoner of the present. This reliance on temporal asymmetry, the one-way street of time, is for me the ultimate proof that consistency isn't a choice, it's a requirement. The very existence of these universal constraints demanding absolute coherence and correctness suggests anything mathematically and scientifically correct essentially participates in a divine plan for consistency.
That's a compelling argument based on linear cosmic necessity, I grant you that. But have you considered the perspective from the inside out? If the fixed law defines what can exist, surely human consciousness surely defines what is real to us subjectively. And from that perspective, reality is fundamentally a set of formations, maybe best seen as games. Now, these games, be they the pursuit of complex math, playing a musical instrument, or setting up a social institution, are incredibly important. Yes, sincere, vital even, but they are not serious in an ultimate, non-negotiable sense.
I struggle a bit to see how describing reality as a game helps explain its persistence or its solidity.
Well, it helps explain how we survive its persistence, how we cope with it. The material talks about the Joker archetype, right? This archetype functions to reveal the fundamental, kind of illusory nature of the game.
When the Joker sees someone taking the social or physical game too seriously, the far-out people who invest everything into a fleeting narrative, they see them as a little bit deprived because they miss the necessary subsequent bursting into laughter when the seriousness inevitably collapses under its own weight.
I'm still not convinced that a psychological archetype, however insightful, can somehow replace the physical necessity that, say, EMC squared or gravity places upon all matter. Those seem pretty non-negotiable.
But the material suggests this psychological counterpoint is actually crucial for stability. The Joker, in this context, isn't just a jester. They're potentially the axle of coherence. They maintain contact with what the material calls the green room, that sort of central, spiritual origin, to prevent the entire wheel of the squirrel cage from spiraling and becoming pathologically insane. Without that occasional liberating recognition that our shared reality is in part a consensual construction, we become trapped in the seriousness of its rules. And furthermore, this emergent interpretive view, it actually has empirical resonance in modern physics, specifically with the concept of the holographic principle.
Okay, can you elaborate on that connection? That sounds interesting.
Sure. The holographic principle suggests that the total information contained within a volume of space, let's say a black hole, is actually described not by the volume itself, but by the area of its boundary, its event horizon. The information capacity scales, as the material puts it, pathologically with the area, not its volume. Now, this is highly non-intuitive, but it suggests that information, structure, and thus potentially interpretation might be more fundamental to reality than the physical volume we think we inhabit. It sort of flips the emphasis from fixed matter to fluid information.
That's an interesting point about information theory, definitely. Though I would frame it differently. Even if information is fundamental, it's still governed by those strict physical constraints we talked about. Let's maybe look at the most subjective observation possible, individual experience. Even these are physically constrained. Consider biophotons, for example, this ultra-weak light released by living organisms just as a result of normal metabolic functions. These are minute, highly subjective observations of internal biological processes, right? Yet their cessation upon death shows they are dictated strictly by biological processes, which are themselves completely beholden to fixed chemical and energetic laws. Their properties, just like the light from matter-antimatter annihilation, are strictly defined by E equals mc squared and the physical constants. So, subjective observation must manifest via objective physics. It seems unavoidable.
Okay, I see why you point to biophotons as empirical evidence of underlying law. That makes sense. But my challenge isn't the light itself. The light exists, of course. The challenge is what the material calls the human obstacle, internal subjectivity. Even if the universe is running on perfect code, the human mind is the receiving apparatus, and it filters and distorts reality with such force that it can render that objective physical input practically irrelevant for achieving shared coherence.
So, are you arguing that human perception is so flawed that it effectively overrides physical law in practice?
Functionally, yes, I think that's a fair summary of my point. The material shows that people get addicted to psychological narcotics, specifically identifying wealth, fame, and fun. This addiction leads to a loss of principle, a fundamental compromise of internal integrity, which inevitably warps perception away from objective reality. I mean, if I can somehow prove, to myself at least, that my subjective delusion of fame or wealth is more powerful or more real to me than the fact of gravity, then the reality I operate within is emergent and subjective, isn't it? How can we claim a coherent shared reality if our internal receiving mechanism is so fundamentally corrupted by self-interest? And we don't just see this corruption at the individual level. We see the breakdown of coherence constantly in society. Sociological failures, I think, prove that coherence is emergent and fragile and easily dissolved by differing internal narratives.
Just think about that example from the material. The moment a prominent political figure was required to forfeit, what was it, $250 million? It was a verifiable, external, singular fact. Yet coherence failed instantly. Two major sociological narratives immediately clashed. One side immediately called the action corruption or political targeting, demanding restitution for years of perceived harassment.
The other side called it justice and necessary correction. The same external fact produced two diametrically opposed, equally committed realities. Coherence fails completely at the sociological level. It shows that deeply held interpretation, and let's face it, self-interest, completely outweigh objective law and rational consensus in many practical situations.
That's a deeply disturbing point, and I agree entirely that the failure of coherence at the sociological level is pervasive. It's hard to ignore. But I believe you might be misdiagnosing the root cause. This moral failure, this willingness to twist the facts to fit a narrative, is precisely what the eternal laws exist, in a sense, to correct. Or at least, they provide the benchmark against which the failure is measured. When self-interest prevails over shared truth, it creates what the material aptly calls a sucker's game, a situation where one group prioritizes personal or factional gain over the shared liberty and truth of the whole. History is unfortunately full of examples. Societal fracture, such as the rise of fascism mentioned in the material, isn't a sign that cosmic law is fragile, but rather that human moral integrity is.
The use of prejudice to split a unified society into rival groups is a direct outcome of moral deficiency. It's gambling with other people's liberty, as the material puts it. The physical laws demand integrity, consistency, alignment. The failure to achieve it internally is a human problem, I maintain, not a cosmic flaw.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the failure is purely moral or internal in that way. If the cosmic architecture were truly fixed and demanded absolute adherence with such force, this level of massive, persistent, fundamental societal delusion, it feels like it should be structurally impossible. The rules of the game, as I call it, must be looser, more flexible than you claim.
Okay, well, let's define what I mean by fixed then, because maybe that's where the disconnect is. This brings us back to the definition of truth and correctness. The highest systems, whether we talk about advanced computing, theoretical mathematics, or the very structure of the cosmos, they seem to demand absolute coherence and correctness. Any small internal contradiction, if left unresolved, will eventually cascade and lead to catastrophic systemic failure. Now, while the journey of discovery certainly involves being empirically wrong, we can look at Newton's deep dive into alchemy, for instance. He treated it as the next logical item on his checklist through nature, and arguably it eventually contributed to modern chemistry. So the temporary wrongness is part of the process, absolutely. But the fixed truth, the underlying principle, is the destination, the goal. When we strip away all transactional motivation, profit, fame, social status, the only non-trivial coherence remaining, the material suggests, is found in aesthetic value and integrity. Doing things right for the virtue of the act itself, simply because the universe requires correctness in its structure.
I fundamentally disagree with that notion, the idea that the destination is a preordained fixed point. That insistence on absolute correctness feels undermined by the historical process of discovery itself. Let me explain why. The quest for knowledge seems to validate continuous interpretation, not fixed law. Consider some of the highest thinkers in history. Aristotle, for example. He's widely considered the founder of biology and the discipline of observation. Yet, as the material notes, he was very wrong on most everything in his empirical findings. His actual science was full of errors by modern standards. Yet his dedication to the question, his willingness to observe and actually build a framework, that's what made him foundational. This, to me, demonstrates that the real value lies in the dedication to the pursuit, the continuous correction, and the commitment to the interpretation, even if it's nonlinear and, yes, full of errors along the way.
Truth, in this sense, feels like it's constantly being stretched and redefined by experience and commitment, not handed down by some preordained eternal law.
I see why you emphasize the journey and the foundational commitment of figures like Aristotle. That human dedication is undeniably the engine of our progress. I wouldn't argue with that. But that progress is only meaningful, I'd argue, because there is an external, verifiable target. We couldn't claim Aristotle was the founder of biology if there weren't ultimately a consistent set of biological laws to eventually discover and correct his initial errors against. The subjective pursuit, I believe, finds its necessary anchor in the objective principle.
But the anchor is only as strong as the interpretation allows it to be. The very fact that the search for truth is inherently and, it seems, eternally a search, that almost proves its emergent, maybe even elusive nature.
Well, to summarize my position, I must reiterate. The material demonstrates that while human perception is indeed deeply flawed and prone to subjective bias, distracted by psychological narcotics, fractured by prejudice, the underlying physical reality is preserved by eternal law that ensures causal consistency above all else. We must cultivate the internal integrity to align our internal psychological world with this external, non-negotiable mandate. Our subjective life is in essence the attempt to live up to the objective requirement.
And my argument concludes by suggesting that the ultimate intellectual and perhaps moral liberation lies in accepting the fluidity of that perceived reality. The material suggests the universe can be described as an oscillation or a trembling. The liberation described by the Joker archetype, then, is a—
But the anchor is only as strong as the interpretation allows it to be. The very fact that the search for truth is inherently and, it seems, eternally a search, that almost proves its emergent, maybe even elusive nature.
Well, to summarize my position, I must reiterate. The material demonstrates that while human perception is indeed deeply flawed and prone to subjective bias, distracted by psychological narcotics, fractured by prejudice, the underlying physical reality is preserved by eternal law that ensures causal consistency above all else. We must cultivate the internal integrity to align our internal psychological world with this external, non-negotiable mandate. Our subjective life is in essence the attempt to live up to the objective requirement.
And my argument concludes by suggesting that the ultimate intellectual and perhaps moral liberation lies in accepting the fluidity of that perceived reality. The material suggests the universe can be described as an oscillation or a trembling. The liberation described by the Joker archetype, then, is achieving the state where this constant trembling is interpreted not as anxiety or a demand for rigid seriousness, but as laughter. It requires recognizing that the black and the yellow, the darkness and the light, necessity and freedom, are, as the material puts it, simply two phases of this same underlying phenomenon. This suggests the temporal mirage of reality is perhaps best approached not with the rigidity of seeking fixed law, but with a sincere playfulness, recognizing the gravity of the game, yes, but without forfeiting our interpretive freedom within it.
So the essential tension remains then. It's between the unyielding physical necessities of the cosmos, that fixed point of causality that mandates consistency, and the inherently fluid, interpretive nature of human existence, which through all these sociological and psychological mechanisms we've discussed, often treats the cosmos as a persistent, sincere, but ultimately negotiable game.
Exactly. And deepening our understanding clearly requires analyzing both sides: the fixed, mathematical laws that seem to prevent cosmic collapse, and the emergent, subjective processes by which we choose to experience, filter, and interpret those very laws. This dialogue, I think, really underscores the need for both perspectives to get a fuller picture.